Well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Merit Janow, Dean of SIPA. It's my real pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon to the 2019 Gabriel Silver Memorial Lecture. Let me tell you just a moment about the Gabriel Silver Lecture. It was endowed in 1949 by Leo Silver in honor of his late father, and it's one of our most significant lectures at Columbia and SIPA. And it was established to bring leaders in international affairs and policy to Columbia to speak about international relations, and in doing so, to promote greater understanding of the world. And through the years, SIPA has welcomed many remarkable individuals to give the Silver Lecture, including Dwight Eisenhower, George Marshall, Rajiv Gandhi, Kofi Annan, Madeleine Albright, others. Today, we are tremendously honored and grateful to carry forward this meaningful tradition by welcoming the Honorable Robert Zoellick as this year's speaker. I think of him as quite simply one of the wise statesmen of U.S. foreign economic policy, diplomacy, and international relations. He's had many remarkable roles throughout his distinguished career, which reflect his deep commitment to public service. And in each such role, he has left a defining mark and demonstrated his commitment to addressing the challenges and opportunities of globalization, engagement with other nations, and advancing prosperity and peace through trade and development. As many of you know, Bob Zoellick served as president of the World Bank Group from 2007 to 2012, where he presided over the bank during one of the most challenging periods of the global financial crisis. During his tenure, he took significant action to address the financial crisis in coordination with the IMF, increase the bank's capital resources, create new financial instruments, as well as supporting the bank's core anti-poverty program. Prior to his presidency of the World Bank, he served as U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, where he, among many priorities, he was a key architect of U.S. policy towards China. I know many of you will recall his very important speech in 2005, which I interpreted to challenge China to become a responsible stakeholder of the international system, a formulation around China's role in the world that continues to carry influence in China and around the world. At the State Department, he was a strong advocate for human rights, and he also served as U.S. Trade Representative from 2001 to 2005, where he took significant actions to bring both China and Chinese Taipei, Taiwan, into the World Trade Organization, while also negotiating bilateral trade agreements and launching the Doha Development Round. He held many other significant roles in government, as counselor to the Secretary of the Treasury, Undersecretary of State, White House Deputy Chief of Staff, and was crucially involved in the end of the Cold War. I had the privilege of working with him at a certain moment when he was Undersecretary of State and I was a USTR, and later was honored to be nominated to be a candidate for the WTO appellate body when Ambassador Zoellick was USTR. In his extensive expertise and reflections on trade that we will hear him speak today, and he will give a remark entitled American Trade Policy, a Historical Perspective. He continues to write on trade and foreign policy broadly. Indeed, I think we will see an article just today in which he speaks to developments in the world. After his remarks, we're very grateful that distinguished professor of history, Professor Adam Tooze, who's director of Columbia's European Institute, has agreed to join the conversation and offer some comments on today's Silver Lecture. He has written extensively and eloquently on global financial matters, including his latest book, Crashed: How a Decade of Financial Crises Changed the World, which is really a remarkable accomplishment. Thank you very much, Adam, for being here today. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Robert Zoellick.
Well, I know that Columbia must be a very serious school because this is a very nice day and it's Friday afternoon and I still see a number of students in the audience. So it's a little different from my time at earlier points. When we're trying to think about a topic today, I agreed with Merritt that we would discuss trade policy, not only because she's an expert in it, because it's getting a lot of attention these days. But I figured that most students usually encounter trade topics as some abstruse amalgam of legal complexities or economic formula. And knowing the law and the economics and the international regimes of trade is certainly critically important if you want to influence policy or advise others. And your dean is certainly one of the foremost authorities on these topics, and she's contributed to a better system. Today, I want to offer a complementary way of viewing trade policy. I believe we should consider trade as an important factor in a country's relations with the world. And trade, of course, is a tale of domestic politics as well. I wanted to present my view from a historical perspective. Therefore, I'm particularly delighted to be joined by Adam Tooze, whose economic histories of the early 20th century and the global financial crisis are masterful accounts of what scholars used to call political economy. I admit I'm leading a lonely campaign to try to retrieve political economy from the academic attic, because in my experience, policymakers need to face problems with a multidisciplinary toolkit, drawing from politics, economics, law, psychology, organizational and institutional behavior, all helpfully based on a grounding of history. And I think one reason I was delighted to be invited to come to SIPA is because I think the education here offers all the students a wonderful opportunity to learn about political economy and the practice of policy making. So let me start by stepping back a few years, say 243. From the earliest days of the independence, Americans have always viewed trade as an expression of liberty. The founders of the new United States thought that new rules for trade could help lead to a changed international system. They didn't see trade solely as a question of economic efficiency. After all, the American Revolution arose out of protests about Britain's controls on and taxes on trade. London and other centers of empire had extended trade through conquest, and they maintained their domination through imperial monopolies. Americans wanted to end Europe's attempt to possess their wealth through exclusive arrangements. In 1776, which as you may recall was a busy year for the new U.S. government, Congress ranked trade at the top of its agenda. John Adams, one of the leaders, took charge of drafting the Treaty Plan of 1776, which was a template for commercial arrangements. His key principle was national treatment, which trade experts will recognize as even a much more audacious objective than most favored nation treatment, which was the idea that with national treatment, U.S. merchants and ships, if not yet goods, would receive the same standing in foreign countries as their own domestic merchants and ships. In 1778, Ben Franklin employed that model agreement in negotiations with France, establishing one of America's first two treaties. The Americans were moving with the vanguard of new thinking about political economy. Both Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson acknowledged the influence of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. Smith, of course, argued that all parties would gain from trade and that commerce was not a zero-sum transactions. The Americans were in fact aiming at an even bigger target. They wanted to change the international political and economic order. In 1785, John Adams wrote to John Jay, a New Yorker who was then Secretary of Foreign Affairs for the Confederation Congress. Adams said, I want to, quote, have a reformation, a kind of Protestantism in the commercial system of the world. The American plan was try to supplant imperial mercantilism with the freedom of independent states to trade as they chose. Now pause for a minute to understand the wider implications. What the Americans were seeking to do is have private parties, not just states, conduct affairs with private parties in other countries. So in today's terminology, the Americans are trying to open doors for transnational relations among non-state actors. This was a very big idea in foreign relations in 1776 and 1780s. In fact, the founders expected that trade would be the new nation's principal foreign policy. Moreover, a fair trading system would require contacts, respect for private property, letters of credit, rule of law. Over time, individual rights would edge into human rights. But Adams, Jefferson, and other negotiators of these new-style treaties faced a very big hurdle. Under America's Articles of Confederation, they didn't have any leverage to negotiate. So as James Madison wrote later, the need to regulate foreign commerce became a primary and powerful impulse to draft the U.S. Constitution of 1787. Once the new Constitution was ratified, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton used the regulation of trade to breathe life into his new economic system. What's often forgotten is Hamilton had to rely almost totally on customs revenues to fund the new government and pay interest on these huge debts they'd accumulated. From 1790 until 1860, tariffs provided 90% of federal government income. In 1792, the new federal government devoted 87% of its revenues just to pay the interest on the debt. Receipts didn't cover expenditures and interest until 1796. And of course, U.S. fiscal policy necessitated an accommodating foreign policy. When revolutionary France went to war with Britain and others across Europe, the United States came up with a policy of neutrality in order to maintain commerce and the vital revenue from trade. Now, Hamilton also recognized that tariffs could assist his plan to support domestic manufacturing. But contrary to later protectionists, Hamilton wanted to apply these tariffs sparingly because he recognized that taxes on trade raised prices for users of goods, they sheltered inefficient producers, and they encouraged smuggling. So he preferred to use subsidies to encourage new industries. A decade later, in 1807-09, President Jefferson tried to translate America's trade into a weapon of policy. He was frustrated by the British and French seizures of U.S. ships and sailors during the Napoleonic Wars. So Jefferson embargoed all U.S. maritime exports. This policy didn't work very well. It hurt Americans much more than Europeans. States of New England threatened secession. Over the 2 centuries that followed, Americans continued to experiment with sanctions, of trade, or as you've seen more recently, of finance, to weaken adversaries or at least signal displeasure short of going to war. After Jefferson, until the Civil War in 1861, Congress's trade policy was really a result of its revenue and debt policies, but determined by political battles among regions and producers. The bills to set tariffs in the United States were one of Congress's most important items of legislation during that era. In general, the new manufacturers sought protection, farmers wanted lower prices and opportunities to export, and the average tariff on dutiable goods rose to about 25% in 1820. Then, in 1828, Congress passed what became known as the Tariff of Abominations. That name should offer a hint. Through a process of maneuvering for political favors, Congress bargained the average tariff up to 62%. South Carolina threatened to secede over tariffs, not slavery. But there was a compromise in 1833, set tariffs back on a downward path to about 20% by the start of the Civil War. The Civil War led to another shift in trade policy, from trying to raise revenue to restricting imports as well. Congress raised the average tariff to about 50%, and that's where it stayed for most of the rest of the century. The North needed the money to fight the war. In addition, look at the politics. The secession of the southern states, then the long political domination of the Republican Party after the war, favored the North's industrial interests. The United States had racked up huge war debts and obligations to veterans. Between 1860 and 1913, right before the start of World War I, customs receipts still amounted to about half of U.S. government revenues. America's interest in trade encouraged the development of the U.S. Navy. Indeed, the United States first commissioned 6 heavy frigates to protect U.S. merchant ships against attacks from the Barbary pirates in the Mediterraneans. Rather than pay tribute, Jefferson fought back. That story is the origin of the clause about fighting, quote, to the shores of Tripoli in the Marine Corps hymn. The Navy, in turn, assisted in opening new markets, most notably in Japan in the 1850s, spurring the Meiji Restoration and the creation of Japan as a modern state power. Dreams of a potentially vast trade with China drew American merchants and then a host of other transnational actors, missionaries, educators, doctors and nurses, soldiers of fortune, engineers, miners, railway builders, indeed adventurers of all types. U.S. trade policy blundered into foreign policy, whether it was intentional or not. In 1876, the United States enabled the Hawaiian Islands to export sugar advantageously. But when the United States eliminated all duties on sugar in 1890, the Hawaiian economy plummeted because the sugar producers had lost their edge. So a few years later, in 1893, the powerful community of American planters in the islands overthrew Hawaii's last monarch and sought U.S. annexation. Congress then reimposed tariffs the next year in 1894, and this time it restored Hawaii's preference. But now the Cuban economy tumbled because it had benefited from zero duties on sugar. That turmoil in the 1890s led to a Cuban insurgency, prompted a Spanish crackdown, and those events are part of the violence that led to the Spanish-American War of 1898. At the turn of the 20th century, the world economy appeared to be in the midst of a major shift. As Europe's empires expanded into Asia and Africa, the Americans feared exclusion from raw materials and markets. Germany and France were offering concessions to others, but discriminated against the United States. The British Empire, which had led the way for freer trade for decades, started to initiate an internal system of preferences. And in 1897, Canada, which has historically and remains a very important market for the United States, began discriminating against America in favor of London. These were the conditions that contributed to Secretary of State John Hay's open door policy for China in 1899-1900. The European powers, Russia and Japan, were carving up China into concessions and colonies, as they'd recently done in the scramble for Africa. Hay aimed to maintain China's territorial integrity with an open door to trade on equal terms. So indeed, Hay's open door policy was American in concept as John Adams' Treaty Plan of 1776, as Professor Tooze's work recognizes. Trade politics was shifting at home as well. Traditionally, U.S. farmers and ranchers, especially of cotton, grains, meats, they were the exporters. By the turn of the 20th century, the big U.S. industrialists, such as Andrew Carnegie, realized they could compete overseas too. But the smaller producers disagreed. Once protections create vested interests, the favored few will fight very hard to hold on to their advantages. Nevertheless, Douglas Irwin, author of a very comprehensive history of U.S. trade policy, points out that around this time, President McKinley edged away from a U.S. policy of restriction to a new idea of reciprocity. Indeed, on September 5, 1901, McKinley declared his fresh approach in a speech to the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. Economic, quote, isolationism is no longer possible or desirable, announced the president. Reciprocity treaties are in harmony with the spirit of times, measures of retaliation or not. A day later, a deranged man assassinated McKinley. The progressive movement of the early 20th century also pressed this trade debate in new directions. Ida Tarbell, who was a muckraking journalist who attacked oil and meatpacking trusts, argued that tariffs imposed unfair tax burden on working families' purchases of shoes and clothes and food and energy. Her colorful accounts also revealed that tariffs were the grease of corrupt politics. Others contended that tariff distortions promoted monopolies and industrial concentration. Maybe some familiar sounds to today. When Woodrow Wilson won the presidency in 1912, his top priorities were cutting tariffs and antitrust. But even more important for the future, the newly ratified 16th Amendment to the Constitution authorized an income tax. In 1913, tariffs still accounted for 45% of federal revenues. With the new income tax, the customs share fell to 28% by 1916 and under 5% after World War I. Poor Jack Lew would have had a very hard time dealing with the budget balance if he only had customs receipts. With the income tax, the United States, without it, frankly, would have struggled to pay for World War I. With the income tax, America could start to cut tariffs without risking unacceptable fiscal costs. But World War I, like the Napoleonic Wars a century before, underscored the ties between America's trade with conflicts overseas. The German U-boat assault on America's long-standing neutrality policy, dating back to Washington and Hamilton, pulled Woodrow Wilson into war in 1917. But this war also transformed America's international economic standing. The volume of U.S. exports doubled between 1914 and 1926. And the sales of finished manufacturing goods actually tripled. Imports fell. So the United States shifted from being an international debtor to being a huge international creditor. Now, the second and third of President Wilson's 14 points of January 1918, these were in effect America's war aims, sought the freedom of the seas and the removal of barriers to an equality of trade. But Wilson did not focus on economic and trade topics at the Paris Conference of 1919, nor would he compromise with the Senate to save the peace treaty, including his priority, the League of Nations. By 1920, the average U.S. dutiable tariff had fallen to 16%. That was the lowest since 1792. And in the wake of post-war inflation and recession, the Republican Congress turned to its favorite remedy, higher tariffs. The Republican administrations of the 1920s did recognize that the post-war international economy faced a very serious problem. The Germans had to pay large reparations to France and Britain, which in turn owed large debts to the United States. So the Europeans could only pay their debts if they received new loans, transferred gold, or sold goods to America. But America was increasing barriers to foreign goods. So the Europeans could neither pay their debts nor buy more from the United States. One American who would later play a key role in transforming U.S. policy, Cordell Hull, observed, "We have learned that a prohibitive tariff is a gun that recoils upon ourselves." So the Trump administration may wish to recall Hull's plain speaking. America's economic officials recognized the interconnections among Germany's reparations, the foreign debts to the United States, and debtors' ability to earn dollars by exporting to America. But the domestic politics of the 1920s blocked the development of a comprehensive solution. So Charles Dawes and Owen Young patched together some debt and reparations rescheduling as a stopgap. Then U.S. trade policy fell over a precipice. After a brief post-war recession, most of the U.S. economy boomed in the 1920s, but farmers were struggling. The agricultural Midwest sought price supports, but failing to get that aid, they called for tariffs. U.S. agriculture was a net exporter. It depended on worldwide prices that would be set by global supply and demand, so domestic protection would have little effect. But as Congress considered tariffs for farmers, the stock market crashed on October 1929, there was a banking crisis and a depression. The Tariff Act of 1930, known as the Smoot-Hawley Bill, became another frenzy of log rolling to raise tariffs like that tariff of abominations. It specified individual tariffs for over 3,300 items. And though 1,000 economists urged President Herbert Hoover to reject the bill, he signed it anyway. Now, the vast majority of economists now believe that it was monetary and financial factors that were the primary causes of the depth and length of the Great Depression. But the Smoot-Hawley Bill compounded the problems and triggered a wave of higher tariffs and retaliatory reprisals. The average U.S. tariff peaked at 59.1% in 1932. And between 1929 and 32, the value of U.S. exports and imports plummeted nearly 70%. During this time, Congress never seriously considered the foreign reaction to the bill. Some 65 foreign governments protested, but Senator Reed Smoot of Utah, one of the authors of the bill, countered, "The tariff is a domestic matter. No foreign country has a right to interfere." Professor Irwin found 20 pages of debate in the congressional record about tariffs on tomatoes. but very few words on the international effect of Congress's handiwork. Other countries started to establish economic blocs based on preferences, special licenses, exchange controls, quotas, even barter. Germany looked to Southeast Europe and then a policy of national economic autarky. Japan created the Great East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, and the volume of world trade fell 26% between 1929 and 33. The United States would spend much of the 1940s and 50s attempting to clear away the international economic debris of the Tariff Act of 1930. Smoot-Hawley had left a bad taste with the American public, but trade policy remained adrift until 1933, when Cordell Hull had an opportunity to reshape American trade history. Hull had had a long political education in Congress and Democratic Party politics. He wrote in his memoirs, "I was 36 years old when my maiden address to Congress, I pleaded for lower tariffs and fewer trade restrictions. I was 62 years old when we finally won the fight to reduce them." So some of these battles last a long time. Hull had gotten to know Franklin Roosevelt in the 1920s, and he was a very early supporter of FDR in his presidential campaign of 1932. After 12 years out of office and Woodrow Wilson's highly personalized foreign policy for 8 years before that, the newly elected Roosevelt led a Democratic Party that was thin on international expertise. So Hull's congressional ties, his standing as a Southern leader, his political loyalty, and his familiarity with international issues through the tariff policies made him a reasonable candidate for Secretary of State. Recall, in that era, it was the State Department, not a U.S. trade representative, that was responsible for trade negotiations. In any event, FDR's first priority was the economic crisis of the Great Depression, and the supremely confident FDR probably felt he would run foreign policy anyway. It turned out, however, that Hull served as Secretary of State from 1933 to 1944, the longest tenure of any American Secretary of State. In 1934, after some early frustrations with the New Deal's experiments with economic controls, cartels, and collectives, prompted, as I recall, by a number of Columbia economic professors, Hull persuaded Roosevelt to back a simple 3-page bill to authorize trade negotiations. Any of you that look at legislation now, you'd be shocked. 3 pages they did all this. That bill became the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934. Now, Hull's bill gave the president authority, through trade agreements, to reduce tariffs from the Smoot-Hawley rates by up to 50%. Moreover, the tariff cuts would apply to all countries that had U.S. agreements that included unconditional most favored nation clauses, what today is called normal trade relations because it became so common. These agreements didn't even require approval by Congress. Now, by structuring the bill as a congressional grant of authority to the president, the administration was bypassing the Senate's role in ratifying treaties. Roosevelt even tried, as you recall happened with most other New Deal legislation, to get Congress to delegate its authority without time limit. But Congress has always been suspicious of a watch on trade policy, so it insisted the authority would lapse after 3 years unless Congress extended it. But what Roosevelt and Hull had achieved was a sweeping shift of authority, from Congress setting individual tariffs on each item to the executive negotiating agreements on a full range of products. Scholars have been quite intrigued about this as an example of regime change. It eased the politics of support for trade. The face of trade moved from how you would log roll to set higher tariffs on individual items to agreements to try to lower barriers. And consumers and export interests now had a say in the process. And the executive branch had the ability to try to factor in national security and foreign policy considerations into the trade policies. The reason why this is an important moment is for the next 80 years, presidents had to battle with Congress as they would today to retain trade negotiating authority. And over time, Congress added limits and procedures and eventually votes on these agreements. But old Cordell Hull first had to show some results to make this thing work. He had to overcome bureaucratic foes that argued for a form of managed trade, making the government into a form of an integrated trading house. And frankly, you can hear echoes of those debates today when you hear President Trump's call for very specific purchases and state-to-state directions to reduce trade deficits. Hull succeeded in negotiating 31 agreements with 28 countries, and he managed to lower the average U.S. tariff to below the Smoot-Hawley levels. By 1939, in the opening of World War II, U.S. exports to countries with these agreements had increased 63% as compared to a 32% increase with other nations. Even more important, Hull had revolutionized U.S. trade policy. After the Second World War, the United States was able to forge a comprehensive trade policy that complemented the reconstruction and recovery of the Marshall Plan. The architects of post-war policies had learned lessons from these failures of international finance, debt, and trade during the 1920s and 30s. In 1947, the United States met with other countries in Geneva to create a general agreement on tariffs and trade, what all of you would know as GATT. The GATT's core principles, non-discrimination, unconditional MFN, shifting from quantitative barriers to tariffs, these were drawn from Hull's bilateral agreements. But the politics of trade remain hazardous in the United States, as they always have been. The principal U.S. negotiator of GATT, a man named Will Clayton, Undersecretary of State, faced a crisis on the home front. Just as he was meeting in Geneva to try to launch the GATT, there was a popular bill in Congress that it would peg the wool tariff at 50%. Well, it turned out that Australia was very dependent on wool exports, and it threatened to walk out if this bill became law. If Australia had dropped out, Britain, which is the leader of the Commonwealth countries, would have exited too. And without Britain, the continental Europeans saw few prospects. So Clayton returned all the way to Washington to make his case directly with President Truman. And in an incident which many of the people in this room that have dealt with trade politics would recall, something similar, Truman says, "I'll give 15 minutes each to Clayton and to his Secretary of Agriculture." The Secretary of Agriculture warned Truman, "You're going to lose up to 7 states in the 1948 election if you veto this wool bill," and he scoffed at the complaints of these other countries. Clayton tried to point to America's long-term interest in international economy and urged Truman to give GATT a chance to succeed. Truman vetoed the bill. He even gave Clayton authority to cut the wool tariff by 25%, and so later that year, 23 nations, the First Nations, agreed on this new GATT, cutting tariffs on over 45,000 items, covering about half of world trade. Not surprisingly, Clayton later referred to Truman's veto as the greatest act of political courage he had ever seen. There's a point here. America's leadership on trade and the international economy has always required presidential fortitude. Over the next 50 years, the membership of the GATT expanded. The countries conducted 8 more rounds to lower barriers to trade. The negotiations, which had started only with manufactured goods, added agriculture, services, standards, rules of unfair practices, intellectual property protection, and dispute settlement. In 1994, the United States and its trading partners expanded the GATT into the World Trading Organization, the WTO, building on the GATT's rules and strengthening the dispute settlement system. Countries retained their sovereign rights to ignore the rules, but if they did, other countries could retaliate by raising barriers. And this is the time where your dean became one of the leading figures on the WTO appellate body. Now, this trading system helped America's allies and partners to recover and grow, and frankly, it expanded great opportunities for Americans too. The process of European integration, begun with the Marshall Plan, carried forward through today's European Union, prospered within this global trading system. In East Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, economy across Southeast Asia pursued export-led development strategies, creating what people at the time referred to as the East Asian economic miracle. Around the world, Latin America, China, Africa, countries relied on this trading system to connect international supply chains, draw investment, gain know-how. Starting in the 1980s, the United States also began negotiating free trade agreements, FTAs, you might have heard of them, to complement the GATT and WTO negotiations. The idea was that bilateral or regional FTAs could more easily become innovators in developing rules in new areas because they had fewer partners, such as services, anti-corruption, transparency, border procedures, IT standards, the environment, and core labor standards. And FTAs tried to eliminate all tariffs not just reduce them. In 1992, the United States, Canada, and Mexico completed the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. Now, the important point is NAFTA was always much more than a trade agreement, because during the 1980s, Mexico's old one-party corporate estate was breaking down. And Mexico's president foresaw that NAFTA could offer an economic and legal framework within which the United States and Canada could support Mexico's democratization, opening of civil society, and economic growth. And the United States viewed NAFTA as a cornerstone for deeper cooperation across a wide range of issues: immigration and workforce, the environment, economic and foreign policy. As Mexico's income rose, Mexicans would both buy and supply more to the United States and Canada, and all three economies, with deeper integration, would be stronger competitors globally. Now, of course, for reasons of history, the United States, Canada, and Mexico are highly protective of their independence and sovereignty. Therefore, NAFTA tried to create a model of economic integration that respected national sensitivities. And here the NAFTA approach contrasted with the EU plan for shared sovereignty. NAFTA also became the first example of deeper economic integration between developed and developing economies. In the 21st century, the United States should view North America as its continental base. A stronger base will help the United States to extend power globally. Now, the United States used other FTAs to deepen cooperation, expand trade and investment, support economic reforms in both developed and developing countries. Today, the United States has free trade agreements with 20 countries, representing about 10% of world GDP, but between 40 and 50% of U.S. exports. And in the first 5 years after these FTAs go into effect, the data has shown that U.S. exports grow about 3 times as fast as exports to other countries. Now, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was negotiated by the George Bush and the Obama administrations, sought to build on these bilateral FTAs with 6 countries by adding 5 more to create a regional free trade agreement. President Trump withdrew from the TPP, but the other 11 countries have gone ahead without the U.S. As the U.S. economy struggled to adapt to changes in international trade, technology, economy, public and congressional support for openness waned, particularly because of exchange rate gyrations and manipulations caused extreme pain for many industries, and some developing countries became powerful competitive threats. Americans began to complain about a lack of reciprocity, and U.S. programs to help people adapt to change have fallen far, far short. So the United States today is in the midst of reassessing the country's global connectivity. In his inauguration speech, President Trump declared that he was a protectionist, the first president to overtly embrace that position since Herbert Hoover. And if anyone was still in doubt, the president labeled himself a tariff man. Now, I believe that trade protectionism, like Trump's anti-immigration policies and his infatuation with a wall with Mexico, are core connections to his political base. And I think he needs to keep these issues boiling. But historically, America's openness to goods, to capital, to people, to ideas, have given the United States an advantage. Competition has compelled the United States to recognize when it makes mistakes, as all countries do, and to try to fix them. Yet there are periods when the pace of change or other fears have led the United States to pull back. Today, the forces of globalization, but also fragmentation, are pulling in different directions, creating a new political tension. Challenges of security, technology, disease, migration, the environment, financial and information flows, these are likely to increase, not decrease. At the same time, people demand reassurance. Some feel a loss of identity, confidence in America's governing institutions. So Americans will need to decide what type of international trade, technology, and economic and environmental systems that they want. The spirit of 1776 looked to liberty, reformation, innovation, private initiative, and opportunity. So did that flexible design that I described created after World War II with the adaptations over 70 years. I believe that a breakdown or repudiation of that system, economic, security, international politics, will prove very costly and dangerous. And we're beginning to see some elements of that. So I was encouraged to see that a very recent survey of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs stated that 87% of Americans believe trade is important for the U.S. economy. 63% recognize that trade benefits both the United States and its trading partners. But the opponents of trade are always more outspoken, and they act with greater political intensity. The U.S. economy is now encountering the costs and confusions of protectionism. The harms are starting to spread globally. Companies are deferring investments. Supply and logistics chains are becoming more costly and uncertain. Without economic cooperation, cooperative action on other cross-border problems, such as climate change or preserving biodiversity, will become harder. I believe the generation of the students in this room will determine America's course on trade and economic and environmental partnerships. And as you do so, I hope you can recall some of the history we touched on today. I hope you can keep in mind that trade is much more than economic efficiency and equations. Trade has been and will remain a key element of America's relations with the world. Thank you.
Adam, if I could invite you to lead us into a discussion.
Yeah. Well, I think you can see why, as a historian, I'm always keen to accept any invitation for a meeting and a discussion with Bob Zoellick. It's an absolute pleasure to be in conversation with him and Merritt on these issues. I have really just two sort of lines that I would love to hear you further expand for us. And they develop immediately out of what you've said, because it's such a rich account that you've given us of the dynamics of trade policy in the US all the way back to the founding moment. But I was left at the end thinking, I still don't understand how we've ended up where we're at right now. Because one of your capacities and one of your, no doubt, formidable weapons as a trade negotiator is your ability to kind of cast an air of calm over even rather troubled waters. And you succeed beautifully in doing that at the end of this talk. But the result for me was a sense in which I wasn't quite certain that I understood how serious you think our current situation is, and how exactly you think we've ended up here. How serious in the sense that, as the whole purpose of your lecture was to expand for us the breadth of the significance of this issue. It is, at its core, as you were saying so eloquently, a question of liberty. So does that mean that we're retreating from liberty now, deliberately, under the leadership of an American president, retreating from liberty? If so, that would be basically the core of the liberal alarmism at this moment. And it, for me, raises the stakes of trying to understand how this can have happened. Now, one way of reading your talk would be to say, this thing with free trade is always very delicately balanced, because, as you said, the interests of the anti-trade groups are very, very powerful. And they're very intense above all. Because in the end, as you say, the macroeconomic evidence is overwhelming. Trade is generally good, but as Manka Olson explained, the costs are concentrated. And so it's always going to take presidential fortitude to balance this and drive this. This is a bicycle, and its natural tendency is to fall over, and so you need to have leadership. That would be the minimal interpretation of our current moment, I would read it as being. In other words, America tends to protectionism. Trump is indulging those baser instincts. And so really don't worry, when we have a new administration, we'll be back in charge. I wonder whether there isn't a much darker reading of our current moment. What about the balance between interests devoted to protectionism, we're interested in it, and the intensity with which they pursue it? And the interest that you mentioned only very briefly in passing, which is the export interest. Has there been a shift in the underlying balance of interests in American business, in the interest group world, which would explain a shift in the balance of force? Or an alternative interpretation would be more political. Has there been a shift in the conveyor belts which translate interests of that type into political action? I was very struck by what Treasury Secretary Liu was saying at lunch, which was that when you were trying to push TPP, your problem was to convince Republicans to come and support, who you would think of as the natural constituency of free trade, to which you then had to add a few Democrats. But your problem was bringing adequate Republican support in line. So another question would be, or another potential hypothesis would be, has something shifted or broken in the Republican Party such that that work of riding the bicycle, maintaining the balance, containing the natural pressure of protectionist interests is no longer being done by what was once one of the great parties of business interests, the mobilization of business interests in a coherent way, which means precisely balancing the particular against the general and insisting on the broader general interest in driving the free trade agenda, in which they were partners with centrist groups within the Democratic Party, which is the coalition that made NAFTA, for instance. So two hypotheses there. One is that the balance in American society has shifted, the other being a question more about the political mechanisms through which that is translated into policy. And that sounds technical, but it goes back in your own terms to the question really of the balance of American society and politics towards these very broad questions of liberty, behind which I sense something even more, even larger, which you also hinted at, which is really something as diffuse as a sense of optimism, perhaps, or a willingness to embrace a positive view of what the future might hold. Because why else would one embrace liberty, after all? Why choose freedom unless it promises that the unpredictable actions it will enable will yield a positive world? Is that potentially the gloomiest interpretation of what's happening? So that's the one line. And the other line for me is something that you touched on repeatedly in your talk, but then sort of blended out towards the end, which is the relationship between this element of trade and American foreign policy and this element of the relationship between trade and security policy, hard power. I mean, you gave this extraordinary account of sugar and the consequences in the 1890s, its destabilization of the Spanish Empire and the Spanish-American War. So that is a truly alarming explanation of the mechanisms which can lead trade to hard power and America's one brief flirtation with outright and overt imperialism. The moment when imperialism was actually celebrated in American history was the 1898 incident. Even people like Woodrow Wilson were cheerleaders of American imperial expansion. Now, that obviously isn't our scenario right now, but you can see where I'm driving to, which is the darkening of the horizon now not simply a matter of a shifting balance within American society, where the balance between winners and losers and the intensity with which that is experienced has shifted, and we know the stories about inequality. And is this not merely a question, shall we say, of the disorientation of the Republican Party as a vehicle for the representation of the interests of American business and capital? Is there something out there in the world which is changing in a way which makes that promise of policy influence through trade less attractive? Now, there have been moments when that kind of shift has happened, and one of them you didn't really expand upon, but is very prominent, which is the 1930s and, of course, Cordell-Hull. The backdrop for the reciprocal free trade is the dawning realization on the part of internationalist Democrats that they need an answer to Hitler. They need an answer to the force of authoritarianism. And their answer at the time is this program of reciprocal free trade, which I think it's a little unfair to compare it to Lighthizerism in the sense that it's clearly a series of crowbars towards undoing the protectionism that has come up in the 20s and 30s in which America has been a driver. And by way of reciprocal free trade, America is opening the stepping stones to 44, 45 and GATT. But the question, of course, for our generation now is China. And this is the arena in which you have been an extraordinarily prominent actor, and Merit's already addressed it, and I know you want to come back to it. But for me, the single most alarming thing of the last couple of years is watching, as an outsider, but as somebody who previously worked on the history of the 1930s, the way in which the security policy establishment in the United States, the state itself, but also the think tank world and the think tank world of both political parties in the United States, is increasingly redescribing America's relationship with China in terms which are of the darkest possible hue. And steps being undertaken, which, as we know in this community here, are affecting even institutions of higher learning and research across the United States in terms of the access of Chinese students and so on and so forth. And that seems to me to give this moment a whole new dimension, because it's no longer evident at that point whether that optimistic liberal vision, which underpins basically the idea that trade could be a positive sum, expansive force, and that in some sense akin to the Protestant Reformation even, genuinely the promise of human emancipation, once we're in the terrain of thinking in terms of security policy, even if it's not the terms of the Cold War, we are moving into a very different kind of game, a very different kind of mindset, a very different way of thinking about these problems of interaction. And is that not in some sense the greatest threat? Of course, advocates of the security policy position would also insist that theirs is a realism which the advocates of liberal trade policy are willfully ignorant of. But that would seem to me to be an even more fundamental challenge to the position of trade policy as part of in the broadest sense of the word, liberal project that we face right now. So those were the two lines of questions that your extraordinarily rich talk raised for me.
Thank you very much, Adam. Just to add, may I add just another layer?
Sure,
to
that
this?
was a short list.
That was an extraordinary, wonderful set of remarks. But let me just add another gloss. I mean, I thought that sweep of history of U.S. trade policy was a really fantastic reminder. Doug Irwin, in a book that you referenced, summarized these periods as a period of revenue production, which you spoke to, of restriction of imports, and then of reciprocity as the three defining features of U.S. trade policy through American history. And I guess one might say that we're an extreme form of the last of reciprocity today, but that its form of unilateralism has taken us off the rails, into a new dimension, if you will, of reciprocity. And you spoke about Congress delegating to the executive branch, the authority to negotiate bilateral trade agreements. And I think I've seen you also say in this period, sort of goad the Congress a little bit to take some of that authority back. That say, you delegated too much because you thought, Congress thought that you would be too parochial and the executive branch would be less so. But in this environment, that is not occurring. There's a different dynamic occurring by the executive branch. And so Congress, you should claw it back. So I guess one question is, each of these periods in history have produced shocks that shifted U.S. trade policy into the next sphere, whether it was revenue or reciprocity or restriction. And I'm wondering, really to build on Adam's question about where we're headed today, if you think the lessons of this period are revealing themselves sufficiently so that you might see shifts, whether it be by virtue of clawing back by the Congress, which will remain forever, I think, affected by constituents more than the executive branch, or learning the lessons of the problems of adjustment are not just the problems of trade and so on. So I guess I'm left wondering, you've given it to our students to solve, but I'd like to give it back to you before the day ends.
Okay. Well, let me try to address at least some elements of the rich and helpful commentary. As Adam recognized, and certainly Merritt knows, and I was trying to, through the exposition of history, give you a sense of, trade policy is always politically difficult, particularly in the U.S. political system, because the benefits are diffuse. They lower your costs of goods and supplies and purchases and intermediate goods, but the costs are felt directly and specifically by constituencies. This reminds me, Stanley Fischer, who recently left the Fed as vice chair, had been a very accomplished professor at MIT, central banker of Israel, IMF chief economist, was once asked by one of those nasty physicists who think that economics really isn't a serious profession. He said, so what about economics isn't just common sense? And Fisher thought for a while, and he said, the theory of comparative advantage in trade. That's not one that people naturally come to. So I won't explain it all, but for the students, if you haven't looked at it, now you have to look at it. The reason I included the Will Clayton story for you in 1947 was this supposed to be the time of American economic dominance, 50% of the world's production. But even so, it was a close-run thing. And Truman faces this warning, you'll lose 7 states in the 48 election. For those of you that are not Americans that don't know American political history, the nice part is Truman actually won the 48 election. It was a surprise. And also, the reason I focused on this Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 34, it's relevant whether it's environmental policy or others, was this notion of a paradigm or regime shift from setting individual tariffs to a mechanism for trade negotiations. As Merritt talked about, one reason for this is, as one former Speaker of the House said, all politics is local. So if you're in Congress, you're representing either a district or a state. And so if you're the executive branch and the president, you're supposed to have the overall national interest, or maybe even an international interest. And so one would expect that a president's perspective on the benefits of trade policy would be different than sort of an individual congressman, which goes to one of the points that Adam dug into, is that you've always had to build coalitions. So I was U.S. Trade Representative for 4 years. In some ways, it was one of the most fascinating jobs because you're kind of a international economic Secretary of State, subject to the Secretary of Treasury, of course. But you have to have a sense of what's going on in the world, but you also have to have a sense of what's going on domestically. So I still know the economic geography of America better. I read about congressmen in the papers, and I know what's in their district. I kind of help bring the votes. And both Colin Powell and Hillary Clinton, Secretary of States of different administrations, said to me in different contexts, whenever I meet foreign leaders, they're more interested in talking about their trade issues than they are the foreign policy agenda. Because for the United States, you've got all these big foreign and security policy questions. For most countries, your foreign policy is your trade and economic policy, as it was for the United States sort of earlier in the process. So that goes to this critical point now about the fact that we reposited this authority in the executive, and the executive turned protectionist. So yes, that's a very serious threat to the system. And we're now encountering an experiment of how that works. To come a little bit to your point, Merritt, what I've tried to prod, it's a dangerous ground to have Congress take back the authority, but I've tried to prod some of the more pro-trade members of Congress to say, look, in some areas where Trump has clearly exceeded the expectations for authority, so there's something called 232, which is on national security, which he's applied to apply tariffs for steel and aluminum, including for Canada and Mexico. I've said, if we do a new trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, why don't you include in the implementing legislation that 232 wouldn't apply to Canada and Mexico? So it's a combination of, it has a tactical effect for North America. But remember, political economy issues are an ongoing sort of drama. And it also would send a signal to the administration about some of the overall authority on this. Now this comes to the support of constituency support. I don't want to speak for Jack, but I think when he was talking about the TPP, his point was he most likely had the Republican support. He was struggling to get the Democratic Party support for TPP, but the Republican support is now sort of couldn't afford to lose any of the Republicans. There's a couple elements of this. One, the United States clearly has to do a better job of helping people adapt to change. So there's lots of questions about ways to do this, whether it's worker assistance program, wage subsidies, but as long as people are fearful, it's going to be harder to get the votes of members of Congress, because whether the change, my view is whether the change is due to trade or technology or other shifts doesn't matter. You want to help people adjust to change. Otherwise, you're trying to hold the process and clock back, which is, I don't think, going to be able to work. But what you're, in a sense, in formal exchange is kind of highlighting on is sometimes there are political shifts. And if you look at the polls now, the average Democratic voter is more supportive of trade than the Republican voter. So the Republicans are partly sort of following Trump. That's not yet true in the Congress. But if you're a person, and this is kind of what a SIPA education is about, is tries to connect policy with the political context, maybe that's a point of opportunity. In the near term, my bet is most of the Democrats running for office are going to pay more attention to the unions that have an intensity of feeling about being anti-trade. They blamed it for a series of problems. Even though it's only a small percentage of the vote, it's something that they come out on and they work actively in your campaigns. But these may change, and that's what I think some of the support of the Democratic voter for trade is partly anti-Trump, but part of it could be a different generation that understands how the world is much more interconnected. And as I sort of alluded to, and as you know, is working on climate change and other agreements, there's no way you're going to get the world to cooperate on environmental issues unless you've got some economic integration. So one of the things in the Washington Post piece I wrote today was maybe we should start to combine trade agreements with some very environmental aspects to kind of, that would build a different type of constituency sort of going forward. So, and the other part of it, and this is a harsh thing to say, but it's the reality, Merritt kind of touched on this, maybe people are going to have to face the reality of what protectionism does. So all of a sudden, if you're paying a lot more for the goods you have to buy, or if it appears the economy's slowing, or it hits the markets. So Trump put tariffs on aluminum. The aluminum industry says, look, 97% of our jobs are people who use aluminum. And so in the case of steel, for example, the Peterson Institute did an analysis and said, for each of these jobs you saved, it costs about $650,000 a job. How's that a good thing? Now, if you're one of the people who get their job saved, you like it. And if you're one of the people that are paying the cost, you're probably doing it at a few cents. But you keep adding these up, and in our tariffs with China now, I think we're at about 25%, in tariffable items. That's a heck of a difference from the 3% that it was at the start. You're going to see these costs through the system. So part of it is, will you start to create a potential for different political climate? Your broader question there, is kind of a reaction that I think touches on much more than trade issues. I think part of this is immigration and its effect on identity in different communities. I think its effect of sort of students of populism would say, how kind of a figure could come up and try to capture the will of the people, represent the will of the people, attack the current establishment. I think that's sort of part of the drama that we're sort of working through. And I don't think anybody can tell you today how that's sort of going to work out. What I'm partly trying to say is whether you're a Democratic political candidate, a Republican in Congress that's hiding right now and waiting for a change, whether it's students in different generation, try to understand this is more than a matter of one tariff or one item. It's part of your country's relations with the world. You then connected it in the Chinese case with security and economic policy. And here, again, as an economic historian, I think you'd probably agree with this. It's hard for me to find an example in history of a country that was an effective security power for very long that didn't have economic power. So I'll go back to Alexander Hamilton. The start is unless you've got an effective economy, you're not going to be very effective as a security power. So this is more than tariffs and trade, but it's an example. If you run stupid economies, that you're not going to be very effective in terms of being able to have not only the power to have a military and the revenue to have a military, but the U.S. success in the Cold War was frankly because the United States and West Germany and Britain and France and others had an adaptable, flexible system that could adapt to change, and the Soviet Union didn't. We're going to see for China, by the way, as someone who's worked closely with China, China's had amazing success. It's had incredible progress. People are justifiably proud as it moves to the technological frontier. And if the Communist Party and the state move into greater control, as it appears it's been under President Xi, we'll see how that works. The U.S. model was what's called the triple helix model, a combination of universities, private sector, government basic funding. I tend to suspect that's going to be successful over time, but we will see. In terms of kind of whether the military dominate the policy, my own experience with this is it's less the military, because in my experience, the military often understand the importance of the trade and economic connection. It's part of your tie with allies. You know, if you would have talked to General Mattis or some of the other Joint Chiefs, I don't think that they would be protectionist by nature. I think it's maybe some of the civilian defense hawks, Tom Christensen here, that are more prone to kind of see things in a zero-sum world. Now, this is not illogical. I mean, in the sense that they've got a sense of obligations that they have to try to think about. And the part of the problem for foreign policy people thinking about trade is it's not zero-sum. Both sides can benefit, and the system can sort of benefit. And one of my theses, more broadly, is the whole nature of the United States system, based on this early transnationalism, is that actually it does well in dynamic environments. If we were sitting in Columbia in 1970 having a discussion about the U.S. future and the future of capitalism, it would sound somewhat similar to what you would have seen in some of the press and paper. And what you saw, not through an easy process and not through a planned process, but the United States and Europe and Japan adapted in that system. Okay? I still think that's an inherent strength of the system, so going forward. So we can come back to China. I don't want to go on too long, but on your point, Merritt, about kind of the new system, I think it's too early to tell. I don't think anybody expected the executive to, in a sense, to take that power and use it for a negative. I think, frankly, knowing a number of the Republicans in Congress, at least more on the Senate side, they're not necessarily happy with this development, but he's got control of the political base, and so they don't sort of challenge him directly. But you can see with it on things, for example, when he threatened to end NAFTA, kind of some of the reaction that came back. But this is, again, where the private sector has an effect. Markets don't like it. They realize it's crazy, and that also sort of creates a sort of restraint on the system. But one of the reasons I'm talking about this now and talking about it here with your students and others is because a lot will depend on what follows Trump. I gave out some data, and I have it other than the Washington Post piece, about the American public's attitude towards alliances and trade and international engagement, far more positive than you often hear in sort of foreign policy discussions. But that's inert. The question is, who will catalyze that? Who will play that role? And I think that will be including, for those looking in the Democratic primary debate, prod people to ask how they're going to sort of deal with some of these topics. And that will be significant, whether Republican or Democrat, who succeeds Trump the next time around.
Thank you so very much. As time is a little bit short, perhaps I'll invite a few questions from our students and guests in the room, and then allow you to offer some further comments. Let's collect 2 or 3. I'm going to start with here and then go over there. Yeah, please.
Thank you. I'm Bradford. I teach EU and international trade at the law school. So you brought up the economic geography of America and highlighted how interlinked that geography is to the support for trade. And so now when you observe the differences in opportunities and income across the America and observe the levels of inequality, I'd be curious in 2 things. So first, how high in your hierarchy of concerns about America today does inequality rank? And what would be some of the policy interventions that you think would be most appropriate to solve it?
Thank you. Let's take one more. Over here, this gentleman.
A PEPIP student here in Colombia. My question is, looking back at the growth of China, do you think there's something which could have been done differently to kind of spread economic prosperity across the world rather than focus just on China? And could there have been a difference, for example, could there have been no Trump if that was the case?
Thank you. Should we get one more? There is one other student. No? Yes.
Hi, I'm John Alexander. I'm in the executive MPA program at SIPA. I see a relationship between economic independence and conflict, and I'm wondering now in this world of globalization, if we've seen the end of major world wars since there's so much interdependence between the superpowers.
Okay, so on the inequality in the U.S., you could actually broaden it from the U.S. When I was at the World Bank, I would talk, the key thing to me on the equality issue is, are you looking for equality of opportunity or equality of result? And you know, we could have equality at everybody earning $100 a year, or would you prefer to live in that society, or would you prefer to live in a society where people, the lowest was $100,000, but we had billionaires? So the second is unequal, but you know, and my own view is that you want to look hard at how you create the equality of opportunity. Now, some of that, of course, goes to sort of basic living standards for health and sort of create opportunities for education and others. Touching on the point that Adam mentioned, you didn't ask it this way, but insofar as it relates to the politics, I think the identity issues were more important than the economic inequality issues, and I'll give you two examples. If you look at African Americans or Hispanics at the same economic level as some of the whites that voted for Trump, they didn't vote for Trump. If it were simply an economic variable, they would have. But it was a question of identity under siege here. And if you actually look at a number of the voting districts, it was not whether it had a high minority population or a low minority, it was the rate of change. And a sense that people were losing control. And frankly, as you probably know, there's some parallels with this in Europe. So I remember talking with some Swedish colleagues about, you know, frankly, if you're in Stockholm and well off, your kids go to whatever school. If you're in a small town and half the kids don't speak Swedish, you get worried about being overwhelmed and left behind. And I think that's part of my own personal view, is that's sort of the bigger issue. If you look at the sort of the economic base of Trump supporters, they weren't the people at the bottom either. They're sort of people squeezed in the middle that sort of felt sort of left out in the process. And this is, of course, an existing fault of the political opponents of Trump. They didn't figure out how to speak to those people and create a sort of sense of opportunity. Now, on the technical side, as I've alluded to, I think it's incumbent to try to give people a sense of hope and sort of rise back up the ladder. And so whether it's, I focus on the policies that help people adjust to change. And I've sort of touched on some of those. But you know, and it runs more deeply. So the opiate crisis and a whole series of other sort of aspects of that part of the population. So trade and to agree, immigration become the fall guys for this. But if you want to support those issues, you have to go back at sort of that underlying sort of political frustration. You know, again, this is one of the frustrations about talking about trade. There have been various studies. The ones I'm most familiar with are from the Peterson Institute. But the savings for the average family of four because of NAFTA and the Uruguay round and GATT are, you know, like thousands of dollars a year. I mean, if you think about what people consume for their clothes, their schools, the toys, so on and so forth, and you look at the effects of these reductions over time, they're quite significant. And we're going to start to see some of that this Christmas if these tariffs go forward, because a lot of them were Chinese goods. By the way, what part of the effect of this was they'll move goods out to Vietnam and sort of other processes. So that's how my own view is it's inequality, it's equality of opportunity. You can do a certain amount in sort of in policy grounds, but there's an aspect of this that is also, I think, a series of frustrations with what people perceived as an establishment that was taking care of itself, okay? And so, look, I always had a good relationship with Hillary Clinton. I thought she was fine, but she was kind of the epitome of that to people outside the sort of the Eastern Corridor. On the China question, you know, keep in mind this globalization that we've talked about has probably helped some 900 million, 1 billion people rise above poverty. I mean, if you look about the inequality effects across the global system, they've had tremendous benefits. And I saw this working on development issues, whether the Treasury or the State Department or the World Bank. You know, more open societies do better, and the know-how, the sort of the investment, the sort of educational process, and China is a big piece of that. I think that the way I try to look at China is China's so significant, you have to recognize how China has shaped and will continue to shape the system. So let's go back to the global financial crisis, which Adam covers. If you notice, a lot of the developing countries, or for that matter, Australia, weren't hit so bad. They were commodity producers. China put in a huge stimulus program. Commodity prices went up. So if you were a commodity producer during these periods, China's growth helped pull you up. China's moving into a different stage now. So actually, you know, this is when you look at the broader trade issues. From 1990 to 2007, trade increased twice or more above the rate of global GDP growth. It's now probably below the rate of GDP growth. But you have to disaggregate regions. And in Asia, it's still moving forward. And you're going to get changes in supply chains, logistics systems, and other processes. So part of the challenge is how will countries be part of that? Or as China moves up the wage scale, you know, will they move other businesses out to Southeast Asia, maybe Sub-Saharan Africa, and others? You have to create the economic context for that. And then this is the battle about, well, will China do this in a way that is also rules-based, which is partly the WTO and partly some of the issues that the U.S. is fighting about. And if you ask, could the United States have done it different for U.S. interests? One of the things we had talked about a little bit earlier is part of the hostility towards China, the sense of confrontation towards China, in my view, is based on a false assumption that cooperation with China didn't work. And without going into all the details, if you look at issues of missile or nuclear proliferation, if you look at the fact that China's current account went from 10% of GDP to 0, if you look at exchange rate policy, if you look at cooperation in the global financial crisis, if you look at the work that I did with China at the World Bank, and frankly, even if you look at issues about some of the sensitivities of dealing with Taiwan or use of force, Tom Christensen's written on this, you know, let's not take for granted what worked. Now, there's a lot of things that haven't worked. And not surprisingly, the nature of a big country that's a rising power is you're going to have to continue to interact with them, whether it was in Jack's tenure or sort of my tenure. And so issues of forced technology transfer, IPR, but even IPR you'll start to see as China moves up the value-added chain, and we were talking about their IPR protection is going to improve. I found that there are many areas with China where you could still find points of mutual advantage. And one of the ones I shared here was that with Belt and Road, which people wonder, you know, is it a geopolitical venture, a development plan, use excess capacity? My view is it's probably a combination of all of those. One of the points that I made to the Chinese leaders last year is look at your experience with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. That received positive support because you used good governance principles. They frankly hired a number of people to work with me at the World Bank. They were more attention on procurement, anti-corruption, environment. And so why not apply that to the Belt and Road? And that's exactly what President Xi just spoke about. Now we'll have to see how it's implemented. Now to link this to an African issue, which is another dimension, is that when I was at the World Bank, there were some people that said, oh, you know, China's taking over, investing in Africa, this is a bad thing. To be honest, I thought it was a little cheeky for the United States or Europe to tell Africans, you know, whose money they could invest in. But the real point, and our record wasn't always so wonderful anyway, but the real point was to try to help Africans deal on a more level playing field. So to me, the challenge was to help Africans develop the capacity to deal with these negotiations. And at the same time, to say to the Chinese, look, if you don't use African workers, if you have too much of a debt buildup that ends up exploding, you're going to create a counter-reaction. And the Chinese are smart. They recognize that some of those factors. Some of these are done by Chinese private companies, and this idea that China controls every element of the world is a little overstated. You know, so some of this has to be, you know, recognizing, kind of working with them in the process. So, you know, part of it is you'll often hear an American foreign policy discussion of realism and idealism, and in some ways it's kind of overstated division. Okay, but I'm being realistic and practical. China exists. It's going to be in this system. Do you want to try to sort of move it to be in a more cooperative form, not only for the U.S. and others, where you have fundamental disagreements, you have to manage those differences, or in some ways work with allies to sort of deter sort of behavior. So I think, you know, it'll be interesting to see. Right now, my point is the U.S. doesn't have a policy towards China, it has an attitude. And It's a very confrontational attitude. We'll see how that plays out. And I suspect, Jack and I were talking about, there'll be sort of some reassessment of sort of what combination of this. But look, we've done this before. I mean, we did this with China after 1949, and it's a politically easy thing to say. And to be fair to some of the critics, Xi's repression in Zhejiang province, the use of technology in a frightening way, the things going on in Hong Kong, those scare people. Right? And so part of the problem here is that Xi's own efforts, which he freely acknowledged, is he's trying to strengthen the role of the Communist Party. For my friends in China, they got less space to talk about things. I mean, so just to give you one little example of this as an anecdote, you know, when Xi Jinping took power, 2012, he created a film about the end of the Soviet Union, a documentary, and all the party cadres were supposed to watch this. Well, if you had that film in Europe, you know, Gorbachev would be the man that ended the Cold War and the heroic end. The Chinese version's a little different. Gorbachev is the guy that abandoned the Communist Party, killed his country, led to disaster, not so subtle messages. It's not going to happen here. This is a reality for Xi. He believes the Communist Party is the leading edge. He believes it got flabby and corrupt. And he's doing some things that I think are popular with the public, anti-corruption. But he's doing some other things that frankly scare people, and we'll see how that sort of works out in the process. Then the last one was
World War.
Oh, yeah, economic integration and conflict. Oh, we should let Adam talk about this one. This is a favorite subject, of course, because there was a classic book you may know written right before the start of World War I, which has not accurately been stated, but it's been sort of summarized as, oh, the integration in Europe is so tight we can't have a war. In fact, what the author said was it's so tight it would be highly destructive to have a war. And he turned out to be right. So I think I can argue this one round or I can argue it flat. And what I mean by that is, for example, the degree of integration, if I take the United States and China, people are realizing is quite deep. And I think that we're starting to see some of the cost effects of a confrontation policy. And that will impose some limits. On the other hand, because there's going to be increased security in the technology space, I think you're going to start to see some decoupling. You're already seeing the decoupling in sort of telecommunications information. One of the big questions, one that your dean is working on here, is because data analytics and big data and data analytics are cut across the innovation sphere, will this decoupling affect all forms of innovation? I don't think it has to, but if it's not done wisely, it could, and that could be very, very difficult. But the last point, going back to the World War I example, is, you know, never underestimate the possibilities for miscalculation. Never underestimate the possibilities that, you know, people start to put themselves into a conflict scenario and they don't have roadmaps off. So for I know Steven Sestanovich couldn't be here with us today, but his book Maximalist is quite good about, you know, Cuban Missile Crisis, sort of other sort of events in this point. And I guess it's a good way to make the larger point is whether it's economics or security. We've had a system for 70 or 80 years. It's had some ups and downs, but you've seen greater prosperity and benefits than in world history. We shouldn't take it for granted. And going back a little bit to Merritt's point, I'm afraid some of our political leaders have taken it for granted.
This has been a riveting conversation. I cannot thank you enough. I wish we had more time, but unfortunately we must come to an end. Adam, thank you for your great insights. Please join me in thanking Ambassador.